The courtroom was silent as Emily Carter stepped down from the witness stand. Her hands trembled as she clutched her purse, her eyes avoiding the piercing gaze of the man she had just testified against. Daniel Graves, the infamous shadow killer, sat at the defense table, his cold, calculating eyes locked on her. He had been accused of murdering 7 women, and Emily was the only survivor who could identify him. Her testimony had been the final nail in his coffin, and the jury had deliberated for less than 2 hours before delivering a guilty verdict. As the judge sentenced Graves to life in prison without the possibility of parole, Emily felt a wave of relief wash over her. It was over. She could finally move on with her life. But as she left the courthouse, a chill ran down her spine. She couldn't shake the feeling that Graves was still watching her, even from behind bars. Emily returned to her small, quiet home on the outskirts of Crestwood. The house had always been her sanctuary, a place where she could escape the chaos of the world. But as she stepped inside, something felt off. The air was heavy, and there was a faint metallic smell that made her stomach churn. She dropped her keys on the kitchen counter and froze. There, on the polished wooden floor, were bloody footprints. Her heart raced as she followed the trail with her eyes. The footprints led from the front door, through the living room, and down the hallway toward the bedrooms. Emily's mind raced. Had she cut herself without realizing it? No, the footprints were too large to be hers. And there were too many of them, as if someone had been pacing back and forth. She reached for her phone, her fingers trembling as she dialed 911. But before she could hit the call button, a noise from down the hallway made her freeze. It was a faint, wet sound, like something dripping. Against her better judgment, Emily followed the sound. The hallway was dimly lit, the only light coming from the setting sun filtering through the blinds. The bloody footprints grew darker, more pronounced, as she approached the master bedroom. The door was slightly ajar. Emily pushed it open, her breath catching in her throat. The room was a scene of carnage. 2 bodies lay on the floor, their throats slit and their lifeless eyes staring up at the ceiling. Blood pooled beneath them, soaking into the carpet. Emily recognized them immediately. They were the detectives who had worked on the Graves case. Detective Mark Reynolds and his partner, Clara Hayes. Emily stumbled back, her hand flying to her mouth to stifle a scream. How had they gotten here? Why were they in her house? And who had killed them? Her mind raced as she tried to make sense of the nightmare before her. She backed out of the room, her legs shaking so badly she could barely stand. She needed to call for help, but her phone was still in the kitchen. She turned to run, but a voice stopped her in her tracks. Leaving so soon, Emily spun around, her heart pounding. Standing in the hallway was a man she had never seen before. He was tall and broad-shouldered, with a shaved head and a jagged scar running down his left cheek. His hands were covered in blood, and he held a knife loosely at his side. Who are you?" Emily stammered, her voice barely above a whisper. The man smirked. "Let's just say I'm a friend of Daniel's. He wanted to make sure you didn't forget him." Emily's blood ran cold. Daniel Graves had sent this man to kill her, but how? He was in prison under maximum security. There was no way he could have orchestrated this. The man took a step closer, his eyes gleaming with malice. "You really thought it was over, didn't you? That you could just walk away and live happily ever after? Daniel doesn't forget, and he doesn't forgive." Emily backed away, her mind racing. She needed to buy time to find a way out. "What do you want? Money?" I can give you money." The man laughed, a harsh, grating sound. "I don't want your money. I want you to suffer, just like Daniel suffered when you testified against him." He lunged at her and Emily screamed, diving to the side. She scrambled to her feet and bolted down the hallway, her heart pounding in her chest. She could hear the man's heavy footsteps behind her, gaining ground with every second. She reached the kitchen and grabbed her phone, her fingers fumbling as she tried to unlock it. The man was right behind her, his breath hot on her neck. She spun around, swinging the phone at his head with all her strength. The blow caught him, off guard, and he stumbled back, clutching his face. Emily didn't wait. She ran for the front door, her hands shaking as she fumbled with the lock. She could hear the man cursing behind her, his footsteps growing louder. Finally, the lock clicked and she threw the door open, sprinting into the night. The cool air hit her face, but she didn't stop. She ran down the driveway, her bare feet slapping against the pavement. She could see the lights of a neighbor's house in the distance, and she headed for it, her lungs burning. But before she could reach safety, a hand grabbed her from behind, yanking her back. Emily screamed, thrashing against the man's grip, but he was too strong. He dragged her back toward the house, his breath hot and ragged in her ear. "You're not going anywhere," he snarled. Emily's mind raced. She couldn't let him take her back inside. She couldn't let him kill her. With a surge of adrenaline, she twisted in his grip and kicked him as hard as she could in the groin. The man doubled over, releasing her with a grunt of pain. Emily didn't hesitate. She ran, her legs pumping as she headed for the neighbor's house. She could hear the man cursing behind her, but she didn't look back. She reached the neighbor's porch and pounded on the door, screaming for help. The door flew open and a middle-aged man stared at her in shock. "Call 911, Emily gasped, her voice hoarse. "There's a man in my house. He killed 2 people. The neighbor didn't ask questions. He grabbed his phone and dialed 911, his eyes wide with fear. Emily collapsed on the porch, her body trembling as the adrenaline began to fade. The police arrived within minutes, their sirens wailing in the night. They surrounded Emily's house, their guns drawn as they searched for the intruder. But he was gone, vanished into the night like a ghost. Emily sat in the back of an ambulance, a blanket wrapped around her shoulders as she watched the chaos unfold. The bodies of the detectives were carried out on stretchers, their faces covered with sheets. Emily felt a pang of guilt. They had died because of her, because they had tried to protect her. A detective approached her, his face grim. "Miss Carter, can you tell us what happened?" Emily nodded, her voice shaking as she recounted the events of the night. The detective listened carefully, his expression growing darker with every word. "We'll find him," he promised. "But until we do, you're not safe here. We'll put you in protective custody." Emily nodded, too exhausted to argue. She knew the man would come for her again. Daniel Graves had made sure of that. As the ambulance drove her away, Emily stared out the window, her mind racing. She had survived the shadow killer once, but now she was caught in a new nightmare, and this time she wasn't sure she would make it out alive. The man with the scar was still out there, watching, waiting, and Emily knew that until he was caught, she would never be safe. The bloody footprints in her home were a reminder, a warning, that the past was never truly behind her. And as the city lights faded into the distance, Emily couldn't help but wonder if she would ever see her home again, or if it would forever be tainted by the blood that had been spilled within its walls.